more about the topic, we are now connected with the chairman of Singapore Chamber Indonesia, Shoeb Kagda. Good afternoon, Shoeb. Hi.
Good afternoon, Indra.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here on Sit Today. So what are the impacts of Trump's trade policy, particularly tariffs and trade wars, to Indonesia's economy and the region in a broader sense?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. I think the key word, of course, is uncertainty, because while Trump has promised huge tariffs, he hasn't executed most of them as yet. I think for Indonesia and in, the ASEAN region as a whole, you mentioned that we need to remain vigilant. But generally, I think for Indonesia, we actually enjoy the U.S. enjoys a trade surplus with Indonesia. We export mostly textiles and a little bit of commodities to the U.S. But in return, we import a lot of services, especially, and high-tech products. One sector that could actually benefit is the healthcare sector, because the healthcare sector is moving more technologically, digitally, and many of the technology and equipment comes from the U.S. So that could be one area where Indonesia could use as a leverage to negotiate for a better trade deal with the U.S. I think with Trump, the operative word would be what kind of deal do we get with him, and he's transactional. So we have to give something in return to get something, and I think Indonesia has to really decide what it wants from the U.S.
Nice. So give something to get a return. He's just a businessman more than anything else. So can you give us an idea? I mean, Indonesia, one of the biggest trade partners at time being, is of course is China and also Singapore. How does it actually going to impact with the changes of the administration in the U.S. right now? How much is actually going to impact the economy here in Indonesia by itself?
In reality, we could benefit tremendously.
Okay.
Trump is, of course, going to ramp up tariffs on China. They're already talking a lot about how Chinese companies can use Indonesia as a manufacturing base to export into the U.S. because Indonesia will not be punished as much as China in terms of tariffs. So Indonesia could actually attract a lot of Chinese manufacturing investments. The key, of course, is how do we attract them? What kind of incentive do we give to these companies for them to relocate some of the factories and some of the operations to Indonesia? You have mentioned Singapore is also a major trade partner. A lot of goods go through Singapore and come through Singapore into Indonesia. So having Singapore actually as a partner to export into the U.S. is also another strategy that Indonesia can use, to boost its exports. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who you're exporting to. Of course, the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. China is number 2. You want to be very closely tied to both economies. But with Trump, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. He gets up in the morning and he changes his mind. So we just have to be very vigilant about what his texts are at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Right, that's interesting. Again, yeah, it's things just change. I mean, he make decision that kind of contradicting one to the other, but it's just interesting to see how he make his policy. Now, was there any changes in ease of doing business between Indonesia and the U.S. during Trump's years, such as in terms of regulation, trade barriers, or business opportunities? I mean, you mentioned there's an opportunity to build manufacturing here in Indonesia to help to export to the U.S. to avoid the tariffs, but what's other regulations, or is there an opportunity that we should build with the U.S. to actually gain these benefits in the next 4 to 5 years?
Yes. During Trump's first term in office, I think he was a lot more focused on China and Europe, and he didn't really focus on ASEAN as such. In fact, even the second Trump administration, I don't know whether many of his incoming administrators or cabinet members actually understand ASEAN and how well the US is already integrated into ASEAN. Now that is maybe a good thing because then your focus is somewhere else, right? But recently, of course, there's been a lot of news on Apple's investment in Indonesia and how the Indonesian government wants Apple to increase its investments. So this is where potentially a person like Trump, who's also a businessman, and of course he's you mentioned earlier in your program, he's investing a lot into the tech companies, especially AI. He might poke his nose into a deal. A U.S. company is looking to invest in Indonesia and maybe wanting something in return. Now that's something I think our government and our policy makers and our business leaders should be very alert to. If it's a big U.S. investment, hopefully it has the backing and endorsement of the Trump administration.
Can you give us an idea of how does the Trump actually doing business? I mean, you mentioned he might gonna poke his nose on how the U.S. company actually gonna invest in Indonesia. I mean, is this something different than other presidents on his predecessors, or is this just a common thing for a U.S. president to actually see where the U.S. company actually invest their money in around the globe?
Well, I think the U.S. government, of course, takes an active interest in terms of its trade and economic and, of course, political relations with countries and with economies, The one thing we have to understand now, of course, is we are moving into a multipolar world where there will be many centers of power. The U.S. has been traditionally, a hegemonic, it has been in a hegemonic position where it dominates the global economy. That might be diffusing a little bit, which means that they may take a little bit more interest in deals that their companies are doing or investing in other economies around the region. So they don't really get involved in the nitty-gritty of the deal, but they do look at how overall U.S. companies are being treated in many of these markets, right? I mean, China is a very good example. Once the Chinese started to post restrictions on U.S. companies, America also followed suit on Chinese companies. I mean, you look at TikTok, right? Ban in the morning and then lifted the ban in the evening. But these are I think the real crux is it's going to be very uncertain for at least the first. I would reckon the first year of the Trump administration, as he looks to how he wants to move forward, and he changes his mind constantly. So that's something that we need. That's part of the uncertainty.
All right. Now, did Trump's approach to China's economy raise effect in Indonesian businesses, especially those with ties to Chinese markets?
Well, this is something that we actually spoke about at the conference this morning. If Chinese companies invested in Indonesia and then exported to the U.S., would they be seen as Indonesian exports, or would they be seen as Chinese? It's very hard to determine, right, who the ownership of a company is. I would say that Indonesian companies can woo Chinese investors, do joint ventures, and in fact, I think the Indonesian government already has a policy of local content, which will be very, very important to make sure that the goods that are exported to the U.S. are seen to be Indonesian goods rather than Chinese goods manufactured in Indonesia. I think that description and identification is going to be very critical.
All right. So yesterday during the World Economic Forums, the Kadin chairman Anin Bakri mentioned that our economy is open for everybody, and and then he mentioned things about the geopolitical climate too. So given the current geopolitical climate, what should Indonesia focus on, maintain or improve its ties with the U.S. and at the same time maintain the China and the BRICS, which is we just joined, and then all the other parties that involved with the geopolitical at the moment?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we're moving into a multipolar world, which means there'll be many centers of geopolitical power. So BRICS is definitely an emerging bloc. and Indonesia should be part of that and should be trading with the BRIC countries because they represent just significant economies and significant populations. You have China, India, South Africa, Brazil. These are big economies. The other thing, of course, is I think Indonesia's stance as an open economy is vital because we don't want to take sides in this emerging geopolitical tussle, especially between the Chinese and the Americans. We want to be open to both, and to be seen as as an impartial, independent nation with our own foreign policy, economic policy, so that we are not trapped into any corner in that sense. So I think yes, Pak Anin definitely is very astute in that sense, and I think the business community and the government here is also very keen to maintain open relations, but at the same time, to be part of an emerging trading, I would say bloc, but a trading community would be a better way to say it.
So you're coming from the Singapore Chamber of Indonesia. So again, with the new administration and the economies going on at the moment, how do you see Indonesia and neighboring Singapore and the Philippines and Thailand, Malaysia, and all the countries in the regions? How can they work together at the same time? Obviously we're competing with one another to get that piece of pie of economy and like export or import from other countries. Now, how can we collaborate together at the same time healthily competing with one another?
Well, yeah, so I think the word is complementariness, right? We are not competing, but we are complementing each other. Of course, ASEAN is a 600 million population. It is the third largest economy in the world. If you think about, after China, India, it is ASEAN, right? And ASEAN countries, I think intra-ASEAN trade has also been growing. Each country, of course, has its priority sectors. There could be a lot more collaboration, I think, in that sense between the ASEAN countries. I think we don't trade enough with each other because in the past, the policy has always been to export to the wider world, especially to Europe, to the US, and in the last 2-3 decades to China. But I think within ASEAN, there is an opportunity to leverage on each other's strengths and complement each other in that sense.
So, what lesson can Indonesia and the region take from Trump's presidency on his first term, and when navigating its future relationship with the U.S., particularly managing economic and security challenges?
Yeah, so I think generally the U.S. security umbrella within the Asia-Pacific region over the last 6-7 decades has been vital to maintaining peace and stability in the region, right? So I think it would be in our interest to continue to have a U.S. security presence. But of course, how does that then match up with the Chinese will be something that we need to really closely watch. Of course, the Straits of Malacca is a very important international waterway for trade. Everybody wants it to remain open, and no country should be able to dominate that kind of waterways, right? So in an overall sense, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think Trump presidency will have a major impact on those kind of issues. I think it will be more trade economic related issues rather than security issues, unless, of course, the uncertainty surrounding Taiwan and what happens there. I mean, Trump is talking about taking back Panama and buying Greenland. Taiwan is a very important strategic partner for the U.S. because of its semiconductor industry, and that is crucial to the U.S. Tech sector. So any hotspot or flare up over the Straits of Taiwan, or that to me is a hot flashpoint within the greater Asia Pacific region, and that's something that I think all the ASEAN countries will work very hard to make sure that it doesn't evolve into a hot war or even a cold war in that sense.
All right, so hopefully that's not going to happen worse, and then we'll see how it's going to play out with all the uncertainty right now with the new presidency. So thank you so much for spending your time here on See Today. I hope I see you again here, especially here in the studio.
Happy to, and thank you so much for having me.
All right. That was our conversation on Trump's economic impact in Indonesia and the region. For today's Business Talk, you can stay connected with us on Instagram, X, and YouTube. Our handle is @CTodayNews. We are also available online at ctodaynews.com. Let's stay connected.